Hi everyone. This video feels like a natural sequel to the last one I made about whether or not sex is binary, which of course it is. I have to say I'm quite staggered by the strength of feeling that people have about this, about how desperate they are to deny a fundamental biological truth. And what they all have in common, these people, is that they all support gender identity ideology, that is to say, the notion that self-declared gender identity should take priority over sex in determining whether people are men or women, and all the consequences that flow from that core tenet in terms of accessing the sex-based rights and protections and privileges of the other sex. Using people with differences of sex development, which is what all these wrongful claims about biology boil down to argue for the elevation of gender identity, makes no sense as a strategy. I mean, it would be different if most of those who claim a transgender identity had one or other of the 40 or so conditions that affect the reproductive tract. But it seems that almost none of them do. Transgenderism, whatever it might mean, is in the head, not in the gonad. So what is the point of trying to weaponize people with DSDs, the vast majority of whom do not claim to be transgender? And what's really concerning is that it's not just semi-literate teenagers who come out with this stuff. I decided to examine an open letter to the UK Government Minister for Women and Equalities, Bridget Phillipson, in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling over the meanings of the words sex, men and women in UK equality legislation. The title of the letter is Biology is Not Binary, a letter from biologists, doctors and other experts, that's self-appointed experts, to Bridget Phillipson. The title of this letter is a portent of what is to come. Of course, nobody is claiming that biology is binary. That would be nonsensical. Biology is the study of living organisms. Of course, there are lots of things that are not binary. Gametes, however, are binary. Okay, first paragraph, and I'm not going to read out every damn word of this thing, just what I think is important. In light of the recent Supreme Court ruling, we are writing to you to express deep concern with these developments and to request that the government take action to restore the rights of trans and non-binary individuals to access public spaces. Shocking. Nobody's right to access public spaces has been removed by the ruling. The ruling clarifies the meaning of the law. It doesn't change it. What changes in practical terms as a result of this ruling is that it is now known to be unlawful for men who claim to be women to access women's single-sex spaces and vice versa. Now, I'm not claiming to be able to imagine how devastating that might feel for them. I accept that it is, and I don't care. In fairness, we've seen very few trans-identifying people stick their heads above the parapet and show empathy for us for not wanting men, whatever they identify as, in our spaces. We have endured years of unremitting nastiness, abuse, defamation, people being fired from their jobs, deplatformed, banned from social media sites, harassed online and in real life, and some physical violence just for wanting male-free spaces and sports. But the signatories of this letter think that being able to access spaces where women and girls are in a state of undress should be the right for those men who claim to be women. And that includes men like these. How creepy is that? Next. The Supreme Court determined that Equality Act provisions with respect to single-sex spaces should be made on biological sex, in quotes. Like biological sex, the terms biological woman and biological man are often not used as scientific terms, but political ones. Again, the task before the Supreme Court was to provide a clear interpretation of the meaning of the words used in the Equality Act. They clarified the law to the best of their understanding of it, and those judges are said to be the finest legal brains in this country. So what is the purpose of saying that those terms are often used as political ones? Is that an argument? I'll return to it later. In the meantime, these are the definitions given in the EHRC interim update. EHRC stands for Equality and Human Rights Commission, by the way, and this is the UK independent statutory body that has the responsibility to ensure the equality law is properly applied. It says, a woman is a biological woman or girl, in brackets, a person born female. And it gives the parallel for man. The Equality Act's original definition of woman is a female person of any age. This should have been clear enough, but it wasn't. And for reasons I explained in a previous video, it ended up at the Supreme Court. And that is obviously why the EHRC has included the word biological before woman and man in their update, when in all other circumstances, the word biological is superfluous. Last sentence. To our knowledge, neither the court nor the EHRC has attempted to define biological sex. They're saying it means male or female. Why are you pretending you don't know what those words mean? You're doctors. Next. The term biological sex has been used to sort all people into one of two groups. Now, although they don't say it in as many words, this sounds suspiciously like the oft-repeated claim that sex is a social construct. This comment left below my previous video tells us that calling it sex is, quote, just a human way of giving order to chaos. And this one asks me what I would say to those that say sex is a social construct. Aren't they technically right? Because we decided what sex is based upon a combination of genitalia, chromosomes, gametes into one category. Actually, no, we didn't decide that. Though, to be fair, it pretty much matches what these doctors say. They go on. A strict binary categorization is an oversimplification. An individual's sex is in fact made up of a collection of characteristics, including external genitalia, secondary sex characteristics, gonads, chromosomes, and hormones, and may be better described as bimodal. Now, this is getting it asked backwards. There were already two groups, sexes, male and female, separate but with complementary reproductive strategies, which evolved at least 1.2 billion years ago. And when people, or the first Homo sapiens, evolved from an earlier hominin species a mere 300,000 years ago, they naturally fitted into one or other of these two categories that already existed. That is how we came to be, through sexual reproduction, which in each case takes precisely one male and one female. We did not socially construct any of this any more than we socially constructed the mountains and the sea. Something that predates human society cannot be socially constructed. Things that can be socially constructed include notions of how male and female humans should conduct themselves depending on their sex, and language and the meanings we give to words. The word sex comes from Latin. It's been used in English since the 14th century to denote male or female, according to which of the two roles in reproduction someone or some living organism is expected to be physically able to fulfill. In the 21st century, why does it still matter that we acknowledge the distinction between male and female? Well, there are some pretty obvious medical reasons, like this woman who didn't tell hospital staff that she was female when she turned up with severe abdominal pains. They thought she was just a fat bloke. As a result, the baby she was in the throes of producing was stillborn. Later in their letter, the doctors have the brass neck to point out that trans people who choose to medically transition undergo significant medically important changes that, if not acknowledged, can lead to clinical harm. Yes, of course, healthcare providers need to know someone's sex and what medical interventions they've had and continue to have. Those of us fighting this ideology have never said otherwise, and the ruling has no impact on any of that. I think that's a red herring. Single-sex spaces, on the other hand, are majorly impacted by the ruling. I've talked about the impact on women caused by men being incarcerated with them or just accessing our public toilets enough times already. So I'll confine myself to saying that I have yet to hear a coherent argument that the distinction between male and female doesn't matter. Usually, I hear them say things like this.
Say if you're told you have a child next year, and in 10 years' time they want to change sex, what you're gonna
What
change?
if I have a daughter who wants to get into sport? Do you think it's fair that a man who has done nothing to his body can compete against her?
Listen, this world is changing so much, yeah? New rules are coming every week, yeah? You can't moan. You can't moan at this world.
That's it. The world is changing. Stop moaning, put up and shut up. That was when we protested outside New Zealand House in London about that country fielding a man in women's weightlifting in the Olympics. To return to the letter, note the quotation marks around the word sex. Why are they there? It's almost as if they know that the sex they are referring to, the one made up of a collection of characteristics, is a fabrication, is in fact something they've made up, is, dare I say it, a social construct, and that actual sex doesn't need quotation marks around it because its meaning is already globally understood to refer to the two categories of people and what they have to do to keep producing more people. As for may be better described as bimodal, they don't sound too sure, do they? These are what are known as Weasel words. The suggestion that sex is a bimodal distribution appears to have become more popular even than saying it's a spectrum, and it's arguably even more ridiculous. When people say sex is a spectrum, they mean it in a colloquial sense, not a scientific one, as in a range of all possible frequencies or wavelengths of whatever. It is actually a deeply offensive notion that at each end of the spectrum you've got the ideal female and the ideal male, and in between there are people who, because they have one or other condition affecting their sex development, aren't quite as female or as male. Those who call sex a spectrum may deny that's what they mean, but if they don't mean that, then what the hell do they mean? And it's the same implication with saying sex is bimodal, which is what this bunch of no-mark doctors seem to be suggesting. So that's what I'll focus on. There is no colloquial sense in which the term bimodal distribution can be used. I expect most people will recall that the mode is the value that appears most frequently in a data set. That is a unimodal distribution with a single peak, like this one, showing the distribution of height of a bunch of young girls with most being around 150 centimetres. And the data set can be bimodal or multimodal if two or more values appear more frequently than others. How can sex be a bimodal distribution? You can't take a bunch of traits like genitalia and secondary sex characteristics, what else did they list? Gonads, chromosomes and hormones, characteristics that are linked to sex, and stick a label on them, sex, and call it a bimodal distribution. That makes as much sense as taking a list of anything, a list of food, say. Let's take bacon, eggs, beans, sausage, tomato, label them breakfast and say they're not all the same. Those sausages aren't uniform, are they? So they're a bimodal distribution. I mean, what the... Sex can't be defined through a quantitative variable. Do they think the individual traits are bimodally distributed? Well, some of them can be. Voices, for example. Here's Zach Elliott of the Paradox Institute.
Traits such as voice pitch are highly bimodal, with an average for males and an average for females. And yet this variation does not mean someone falls out of their sex category for having traits atypical of their sex.
But others can't. Okay, it so happens that I managed to find a bimodal distribution of external genitalia. Now really, we've got female genitalia on the left, male on the right. So most individuals cluster around typical male or female, but there's some overlap in the middle. To understand this, of course, you first have to know what male and female are. That they are, in fact, the names of the two sexes. I can't imagine what exactly is being quantified here. What is on the x-axis? It says external genitalia traits, which is meaningless. My point in asking Grok to generate this hypothetical graph was to try to show just how nonsensical it is. And here's an equally useful one I made showing female secondary sex characteristics. You're welcome. No, you wouldn't quantify real data on genitalia in this way. A bimodal distribution applies to continuous data with two peaks in a frequency plot. Sex is categorical, two categories, male and female. But that's not to say that the word bimodal can't apply to categorical data. It can when two categories tie for the highest frequency. You could, for example, ask a class of 30 kids their favourite colour. If 10 of them liked blue and 10 liked red and the remaining 10 kids like various other colours, one weirdo here likes brown best, there you go, two modal values. The categories here are the children who like red, the children who like blue, etc. So how do we plot sex? There is only one way. You plot the number of members of the male category, the male sex, and the number of female members of the female sex. If we do it by birth sex, there are about 70 million males born every year and about 67 females. Included in the female category is everyone who is female, regardless of age, of fertility, of whether they have a DSD. Same goes for the male category. I think that, strictly speaking, this isn't bimodal because there are significantly more males born, so the modal value is the figure for male births. That is the most frequent value in the data set. If there was the same number of males as females born each year, it would be bimodal. But this would not satisfy those who want to claim that sex is bimodal because of DSDs, of different hormone levels, different sized breasts and penises and whatever. These doctors say each of these traits can vary beyond two categories and may or may not coincide with other measures of sex within the same individual. It doesn't matter because none of them are in fact measures of sex. I've heard the evolutionary biologist Colin Wright refer to this wrongful attempt to claim that sex is made up of a collection of characteristics as the polythetic fallacy, which isn't a real formal logical fallacy. It's one he made up, but it makes sense. The word polythetic refers to a system where members of a large group share a large number of characteristics, though not all characteristics are essential for membership and some may not be universal. Polythetic categories exist in many different fields, but if we stick to biology, mammals are polythetic, being defined by a combination of characteristics like warm blood, mammary glands, fur or hair, etc. Sex is not a polythetic category because it's only defined by which gamete each of the two sexes evolved to produce. But they're trying to pretend that it is. Why? Let's just remind ourselves of their list. External genitalia, gonads, secondary sex, characteristics, hormones, chromosomes. Yeah, I'm sure we can think of conditions that cause anatomical variations that presumably inspired this list, whether it be ambiguous genitalia, having both ovarian and testicular tissue, hirsutism in females, gynecomastia in males. None of these traits are sufficient in themselves to determine which sex someone is, which, of course, is precisely why they are being named in an attempt to confound the accepted biological definition of sex. They say, thus, a binary immutable model of sex is not capable of capturing biological diversity present in human populations. And as a result, it is an unsafe basis for policy. Unsafe basis for policy. That's a strong claim. The relevant policies would be those governing the provision of single-sex services, sports, adverts for employment, etc. How would it be unsafe to have male and female as the basis for policies governing, let's say, communal changing and showering areas in a leisure centre? And what would be the alternative? Why is it necessary to capture all of biological diversity in human populations when devising such a policy? We are not told, and we have to wade through a load of unnecessary detail about what causes certain DSDs. In other words, a gish gallop. We have to wade through a gish gallop to get to what they really want to say and what would seem to be the main point of their letter, which is in the penultimate paragraph. Bring it up. Here we go. Statements that biological sex is binary are only approximately accurate in the context of reproduction or fertility, which are largely irrelevant to daily life and not a good basis for determining access to toilets or other spaces. I think that here they are tentatively conceding that sex is binary or approximately binary. I mean, what? Like there are more or less two sexes needed for the reproduction of the species, but that's largely irrelevant and not a good basis for determining access to toilets or other spaces. Okay, so what would be a good basis for determining access? Because obviously women's feelings about who we should get undressed in front of don't matter, and women's safety doesn't matter. The fact that the overwhelming majority of sex offences are committed by men, 98% according to the latest crime figures, and the vast majority of victims are female, that doesn't matter. The fact that mixed sex changing areas have proven less safe for women and girls doesn't matter. What matters? Let's see. Transgender, non-binary, blah, 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 may be at risk of social exclusion, health inequality, harassment, and violence in society due to the employment of simplistic models and biological essentialism. We are concerned that the recent ruling and the government's adoption of the EHRC's interim update does not advance women's rights, but introduces new risks for many members of our society, including cisgender women. New risks, keeping the word woman for females of any age and man for males of any age, and designating that some spaces and services be single sex. What risks does that introduce for women? Again, we are not told. But this is the fundamental issue here, the very reason why this appeal to the Supreme Court was brought by the grassroots campaigning group for Women Scotland. It was because for the past 15 years, the word woman had been taken by many service providers to include men who called themselves trans women or just women. And this has been causing massive problems for women and girls, especially lesbians. There have been detailed submissions about this to the Supreme Court, but these doctors have just completely disregarded all of that, not worth a moment's consideration. But, oh, look at what those poor trans and non-binary people may be at risk of. But even here, they're not showing their workings. How exactly do they imagine that sticking to the correct meanings of the words man and woman may cause social exclusion, harassment, and all the rest of it? And they misuse the term biological essentialism, which is the belief that certain behaviours and abilities are determined by one's biological sex. It doesn't mean sticking to biological truths about what makes someone male and female. These doctors are ignorant and shockingly lacking in integrity. They are just another example of how this pernicious ideology gets its claws into people and turns them into muppets. And that's being charitable. Finally, to return to the claim, before I run out of steam, the claim I read earlier, it's a bit ironic that they suggest the terms biological woman and biological man are used politically when the very purpose of trying to redefine sex by conflating it with chromosomes, hormones and physical characteristics is to obfuscate the fact that there are two sexes and one has historically been placed by the other in a subordinate position. One has historically been something of a physical threat to the other. Trying to erase the boundaries between the sexes is a purely political objective, and it's a regressive one. Obviously, the progressive position would be to fight for the right to be gender non-conforming without lying about your sex, without normalizing lying about one's sex and doing immense harm to others in the process. Okay, that's it, really. Thanks for watching. Back soon. Bye.